Season 1 of Better Call Saul introduces Jimmy McGill, a struggling public defendant in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Jimmy had grown up a hustler and a con artist, but recently resolved to turn his life around. His older brother Chuck is a highly successful lawyer, working with law partner Howard Hamlin at the firm Hamlin, and McGill, or HHM. Chuck has spent most of his life getting Jimmy out of trouble and eventually forced his brother to stop the cons and find a real job. Inspired by Chuck, Jimmy got an online law degree and passed the bar exam. While studying for the bar exam and working in HHM's mailroom, Jimmy met and befriended Kim Wexler, who upon passing the bar, was hired by Chuck and Howard's company. Jimmy was passed over for a job at HHM, which he blames Howard for, and began working in the low-paying and under-respected job of public defense. As Jimmy tries to get his burgeoning law career off the ground, he also becomes a caretaker for his brother. Chuck becomes convinced that he has electromagnetic hypersensitivity, leading him to become a recluse with no electronics or sunlight in his home. Both Jimmy and medical professionals suspect that Chuck's condition is entirely psychosomatic. Despite his new career in law, Jimmy hasn't fully left behind his old ways and oftentimes tries to use his old hustler tactics to get ahead. While trying to win over new clients, the embezzling husband and wife duo the Kettlemans, Jimmy hires some accomplices to stage a car accident. Unfortunately, his accomplices target the wrong vehicle, putting them and Jimmy on the radar of drug kingpin Tuco Salamanca. Tuco and his men threaten to kill Jimmy, but Tuco's associate Nacho Varga convinces him it would be in their best interest to spare the lawyer's life. After seeing Jimmy's natural rapport with his older clients, Kim suggests he start specializing in elder law. While working with his new clients, residents of the Sandpiper Crossing nursing home, Jimmy discovers that Sandpiper was severely overcharging residents, to the point of elder abuse. Jimmy and Chuck work together to compile evidence for a class action lawsuit, and eventually Chuck suggests the case was too big for just the two of them, and that HHM should be brought in to help. During a meeting with HHM, Howard Hamlin agrees to take the case, but on the condition that Jimmy not be further involved, in exchange for a percentage of the eventual settlement. Jimmy refuses the deal, but then discovers that Chuck had not only told Howard to bar Jimmy's participation in the lawsuit, but had also been the one to refuse to hire Jimmy at HHM in the first place. Despite Jimmy's best efforts to grow and make his brother proud, Chuck never saw him as anything but the con man he used to be. Devastated by his brother's betrayal, Jimmy allows HHM to take the case and stops taking care of Chuck and his condition. While Jimmy relapses into his old hustler lifestyle, Kim informs him that HHM was bringing in another law firm, Davis & Main, to assist with the Sandpiper case. Davis & Main were impressed by Jimmy's rapport with the elderly clients and want to hire him full-time, leaving Jimmy to consider what he really wants for his future. Elsewhere in Season 1, Jimmy befriends parking lot attendant Mike Ehrmantraut. Mike is a former cop, still grieving the loss of his son Matt, who was murdered by fellow police officers when they feared that Matt would snitch about their corruption. Mike murdered those cops in revenge and is now taking odd jobs on the side to provide for his daughter-in-law Stacy and his granddaughter Kaylee. One such job sees Mike working as hired muscle for a pharmaceutical employee named Price, who sells pills to Nacho Varga. In Season 2 of Better Call Saul, Jimmy and Kim grow closer together, and he even shows her how to run a basic con to have a stock trader buy them expensive drinks. Kim enjoys the thrill of the con and winds up spending the night with Jimmy, while also convincing him to accept the offer of working for Davis & Main. When the police start investigating Price and his drug-selling side hustle, and Mike asks for Jimmy's assistance in exonerating him, Jimmy uses some unconventional means to clear Price's name. This upsets Kim, as Jimmy's unethical actions could cost him his new job at Davis & Main, and since she recommended him for the job, his actions could reflect negatively on her. When Jimmy decides to run a commercial to draw in new Sandpiper clients without first getting permission, his bosses at Davis & Main reprimand him, while Howard and Chuck punish Kim by demoting her. To win back her boss's favor, Kim manages to secure a large new client, Mesa Verde Bank, but despite this success, Kim still isn't treated with the respect she deserves. Jimmy becomes frustrated with the straight and narrow life of Davis in Maine and orchestrates his own firing so that he can start his own law firm with Kim. Kim agrees to quit HHM, but instead of forming a law firm together, Jimmy and Kim start their own separate firms in the same building. When Kim tries to secure Mesa Verde as her own client, Chuck belittles her skills to Mesa Verde's CEO Kevin Wachtel, leading him to remain at HHM. Furious for Kim, Jimmy decides to take Mesa Verde documents from Chuck's home to a copy store, secretly altering them. These forged documents cause a delay in Mesa Verde's application for a new branch, leading to Kevin firing HHM and hiring Kim instead. Not believing he made the paperwork mistake, Chuck begins to suspect that Jimmy was responsible and begins trying to find proof. Jimmy, realizing the worker at the copy shop was the only witness for the crime, races to pay off the worker. As Jimmy watches from across the street, Chuck braves the outside sunlight to interrogate the worker. Unfortunately, the electromagnetism is too much for Chuck to bear, causing him to faint and hit his head. Concerned more for his brother's safety than being caught, Jimmy rushes to Chuck's side and calls him an ambulance. Upon Chuck's recovery, he confesses to Jimmy that his mistake on the Mesa Verde paperwork made him question his skills as a lawyer and that he now wished to retire. Racked with guilt, Jimmy confesses to tampering with the paperwork to frame Chuck. After Jimmy leaves, it's revealed that Chuck had secretly been recording their conversation to secure Jimmy's confession. As for Mike, Nacho pays for his help in killing Tuco, explaining that the drug dealer was too erratic and posed a danger to Nacho if his side hustle selling Price's pills was discovered. Mike refuses to kill Tuco, but does agree to come up with a plan that would see Tuco imprisoned. Mike goads Tuco into assaulting him, leading to Tuco's arrest. When the police find Tuco's gun at the scene, the drug kingpin's uncle Hector Salamanca threatens Stacy and Kaylee's lives to force Mike into telling the police that the gun belonged to him and ensure Tuco got a lighter sentence. In retaliation for the threats made against his family, Mike begins targeting Hector Salamanca's drug shipments, stealing $250,000 from one of Hector's trucks and leaving the driver tied up. Mike hoped that this would draw the attention of the authorities toward Hector's drug operation, but Nacho informs him that Hector had the scene cleaned up and plans to execute the driver. This leads Mike to try to take matters into his own hands, buying a sniper rifle to assassinate Hector with. But before he can take the shot, an unseen stranger leaves Mike a simple one-word message: don't. In Season 3, Chuck is reacclimating himself to the outside world and planning his return to work, all the while scheming on how to use Jimmy's recorded confession to take him down. Howard suggests that the confession has no real legal value, but Chuck has his own secret plan, orchestrating for Kim to discover the tape's existence. Kim takes on Jimmy as a client to give them attorney-client privilege, then informs Jimmy that Chuck had set him up. Despite her pleas for Jimmy to stay calm, as the tape confession couldn't legally be used against him, an angry Jimmy breaks into Chuck's home and destroys the tape. But this was all a part of Chuck's plan, as Howard and a private investigator reveal themselves, having witnessed Jimmy breaking into Chuck's home to destroy evidence. And so, Jimmy is arrested. Chuck convinces the prosecutor not to pursue criminal charges against Jimmy, but instead force him to submit a confession of his crimes to the New Mexico Bar Association, which would potentially lead to Jimmy's disbarment. And so, Kim and Jimmy prepare for a legal battle against Chuck. Kim and Jimmy's legal strategy is primarily focused on discrediting Chuck by exposing his psychosomatic electromagnetic hypersensitivity. While Chuck is taking the stand to give his testimony, all of the lights are turned off and all electronics are removed from the room. Jimmy invites Chuck's ex-wife Rebecca to the courtroom, which throws off Chuck. While Chuck is on the stand for cross-examination, Jimmy reveals that he had hired a pickpocket named Huel to plant a cell phone battery in Chuck's pocket, meaning he had been exposed to electromagnetic energy for over an hour without noticing. When the court rules that Chuck's mental health should not be called into question, Chuck snaps at the idea that his condition wasn't real and angrily vents at Jimmy, which shocks the entire room. Ultimately, the New Mexico Bar Association decides to suspend Jimmy for a year, which he and Kim take as a victory. Jimmy had already paid for several TV ad spots to market his law practice, so Jimmy takes on the alias Saul Goodman to begin selling his airtime to other local businesses. Meanwhile, Kim struggles to pay for her shared office with Jimmy now that he's out of work, so she takes on another client, overextending herself and eventually falling asleep while driving, resulting in a crash that breaks her arm. In a petty attempt to get revenge on Chuck, Jimmy decides to pay a visit to HHM's insurance company to detail the nature of Chuck's mental health struggles. Jimmy then gets word that the Sandpiper case is finally ready to settle, which would net him over $1 million for his share. Unfortunately, HHM and Davis and Maine turn down the offer, believing they can receive more money if they continue to fight. The only way for Jimmy to receive his money now and keep his dream practice with Kim afloat is to convince Sandpiper resident Irene to accept the settlement against HHM's counsel. And so Jimmy goes about manipulating Irene into taking the settlement, which ostracizes her from her friends. Feeling guilty, Jimmy reveals his manipulations to Irene and her friends, which results in Irene retracting her acceptance and costing Jimmy his $1 million. Jimmy also decides to break his office lease, allowing Kim to work from home and take on a lighter workload. Meanwhile, Chuck's outburst on the stand has caused him to reevaluate his condition and resolve to conquer it. He begins reacclimating himself to sunlight and electronic devices and is eventually ready to return to work at HHM full-time. Unfortunately, Jimmy's visit to HHM's insurance company to inform them of Chuck's condition causes them to substantially raise their malpractice premiums unless Chuck agrees to be supervised by another attorney. Chuck refuses this proposal, so Howard is forced to push Chuck into retirement, paying him an $8 million buyout. Also in Season 3, Mike learns who was responsible for intervening in his plan to assassinate Hector Salamanca, a rival drug dealer named Gus Fring. Both Gus and Hector work for the drug cartel leader Don Eladio, distributing his cocaine from Mexico into America. Recently, Eladio has shown more favor toward Gus, spurning a lot of jealousy from Hector and the Salamanca family. Gus is impressed by Mike's skill and ingenuity, and agrees to hire him at the company Magical Electromotive to help him launder the money stolen from Hector. Meanwhile, Nacho is becoming even more disillusioned with Hector's leadership when Hector forces Nacho's innocent working-class father Manuel to use his business as a drug front. It's the final straw for Nacho. Nacho secretly replaces Hector's heart medicine with ibuprofen, hoping it would lead to a heart attack and death. During a meeting between Gus, Hector, and their associate Juan Bolsa, Hector is informed that Don Eladio wants the Salamancas to use Gus's trucks to smuggle drugs into America. This enrages Hector, who then suffers a stroke. To avoid any suspicion, Nacho then replaces Hector's fake capsules with his real medicine, which Gus takes notice of. As the season comes to a close, Chuck has been defeated and humiliated, costing him the career he loved so much. He relapses in his electromagnetic hypersensitivity and begins to destroy his own home, then intentionally sets his house on fire while he's still trapped inside. In Season 4 of Better Call Saul, the death of Chuck seems to be hitting everyone hard except for Jimmy. Howard, unaware of Jimmy's insurance manipulation, blames himself for Chuck's death, having pushed him out of HHM. Jimmy happily lets Howard take the blame and continues to go about his life business as usual, which greatly concerns Kim. In his year of suspension from practicing law, Jimmy uses his alias Saul Goodman to sell burner phones to criminals. Kim takes a job working at Schweikert & Coakley, allowing her to handle the Mesa Verde account, which bores her, and pro bono defense counsel work, which excites and inspires her. Meanwhile, Mike is pulled further into business with Gus, and is placed in charge of overseeing the top secret construction of an underground meth super lab. Gus hires German engineer Werner Ziegler and his team to construct the lab. But if the Salamancas or Don Eladio discovered his business plans, it would be a disaster. Speaking of the Salamancas, Salamancas, Gus hires the best medical team possible to keep Hector alive. Just as Hector's mind begins to recover, Gus sends away the medical team, halting Hector's recovery and trapping the elder Salamanca in his own body as torture. Gus also informs Nacho that he was aware of his involvement in Hector's stroke, threatening to expose him to the Salamancas if Nacho didn't agree to secretly work for Gus. The Salamancas then send Lalo Salamanca to run the business in Hector's absence. He takes on a much more hands-on approach to the business, causing a great deal of stress for Nacho. Lalo gives his uncle Hector a bell to help him communicate, and begins looking into Gus's operations to find a way to bring him down and restore the Salamancas to top favor. When Werner begins missing his wife during the long months of construction, he makes plans to run away to be with her, inadvertently exposing details of the underground construction to Lalo. As Lalo tries to track Werner down, he kills Fred, an innocent employee of a money transferring service, for failing to give up more info on Werner. This infuriates Gus, and a reluctant Mike is forced to kill Werner. Meanwhile, as Jimmy's year of suspension comes to a close, his request for reinstatement to practice law is denied due to the chairman finding him insincere. Kim suggests Jimmy be more open about his emotions toward Chuck's death, so on his appeal, Jimmy gives a rousing speech about his desire to make his brother proud and honor the McGill name. His appeal succeeds, and even Kim is convinced that Jimmy had finally processed Chuck's death, but Jimmy then admits it was all a con to be reinstated, and he would now be practicing law under his alias Saul Goodman. In season 5 of Better Call Saul, Jimmy is continuing to practice law under his alias Saul Goodman. Meanwhile, Kim is beginning to feel disillusioned by her work with Mesa Verde, and when the bank wants her to forcefully evict a man named Acker from his home so they can build a new branch there, she enlists the help of Jimmy to stop Mesa Verde. Jimmy represents Acker against Mesa Verde and uses every backhanded scheme and con he can to sabotage Kim and the bank's case. Eventually, Jimmy and Kim discover that Mesa Verde's logo was stolen from a photographer and force the bank to drop their pursuit of Acker's property. This angers both Mesa Verde and Kim's employers at Schweikert and Coakley, and ultimately she decides to quit to focus on her pro bono work. Kim and Jimmy then get married, allowing their conversations to be legally protected under spousal privilege. Meanwhile, Salamanca dealer Crazy 8 is arrested, and Nacho convinces Lalo to hire Jimmy as a lawyer to represent him. Jimmy arranges for Crazy 8's release in exchange for becoming an informant for DEA agent Hank Schrader. Lalo uses this to his advantage, having Crazy 8 expose the locations of Gus's money drops. In retaliation, Mike, on Gus's orders, alerts the authorities to Lalo's involvement in Fred's death. Upon his arrest for murder, Lalo once again calls upon Jimmy for his legal assistance. Jimmy arranges for Lalo to be released on a $7 million bail, but the only problem is Jimmy would have to pick up the money and deliver it himself. In exchange, Lalo offered to pay him $100,000. And so, against Kim's concerns, Jimmy heads out into the desert to pick up 2 bags filled with money from the Salamanca cousins Marco and Lionel. On his way back, Jimmy is confronted by armed gunmen who attempt to steal the money from him. Jimmy and the money are rescued by Mike, but when all of the vehicles are destroyed, Jimmy and Mike are forced to make their trek home on foot. Upon reaching civilization, Jimmy posts Lalo's bail and returns home to Kim, seriously traumatized by the ordeal. Jimmy tells both Lalo and Kim that his car broke down, forcing him to walk home alone. This acts as a cover for his friendship with Mike and therefore his association with Gus. Kim discovers the truth when finding a bullet hole in Jimmy's coffee mug, and Lalo investigates Jimmy's car to similarly discover bullet holes. When Lalo arrives to confront Jimmy over his lies, Mike rushes to the scene with a sniper to protect his friend. But Mike wasn't needed, as Kim fearlessly stands up to Lalo, insisting that random passersby could have shot up Jimmy's car after he abandoned it. She then berates Lalo for not trusting Jimmy despite getting him out of jail for murder. Lalo accepts this explanation and leaves. Lalo retreats to his home in Mexico, bringing Nacho along with him. Lalo introduces Nacho to Don Eladio, who approves of his business plans. While in Mexico, Gus calls on Nacho to assist in his plans to assassinate Lalo. Gus would send in a team of killers, Nacho just had to let them in. And so Nacho opens Lalo's gates to allow the assassins into his compound, then flees the scene. Lalo is able to fend off his attackers, killing all but one, then forces the survivor to inform Gus that Lalo had successfully been killed. As the season comes to a close, Kim suggests that she and Jimmy try to sabotage Howard's career in order to force the Sandpiper's settlement. This would provide a very generous payout to them both, allowing them to focus on the legal defense work they felt called to. Jimmy is hesitant to the idea and begins to fear that his scheming conman ways had finally begun to corrupt the morals of Kim Wexler. Season 6 of Better Call Saul opens with Nacho on the run, following his assistance in helping Gus's men raid the Salamanca compound. The Salamanca family is hunting him for revenge over the supposed death of Lalo, and Gus wants Nacho dead before the Salamancas catch him so that he can't reveal Gus's involvement in the assault. Ultimately, the kind-hearted Mike convinces Gus to make a deal with Nacho. Nacho would turn himself over to Gus in exchange for Fring's men ensuring his father's safety. In addition, when Gus turns Nacho over to the Salamancas, they would allow him to fake an escape attempt, which would result in a mercy killing instead of a prolonged torture at the hands of the Salamanca family. And so, as Gus turns Nacho over to the Salamancas, Nacho escapes. But instead of running, he steals a gun and chooses to die on his own terms. But of course, Lalo isn't actually dead and has faked his own death. Lalo informs his Uncle Hector of his survival and his plan to search for intel they could use against Gus to prove his involvement in the assassination attempt. Lalo's only lead is Werner Ziegler, so he heads to Germany to uncover why this German engineer was involved with Gus Fring. Eventually, Lalo tracks down Casper, a member of Werner's crew during the construction of Gus's secret meth superlab. Casper reveals everything to Lalo, who returns to America with everything he needed to take down his family's bitter rival. Meanwhile, Gus has deduced that Lalo survived the attack and works with Mike to prepare for the eventual retaliation. Elsewhere, Jimmy has become a pariah amongst his colleagues in the courthouse for his assistance in freeing Lalo from prison, and threats of an investigation against him are raised. But Jimmy's work with such a high-profile member of the cartel also leads to a massive boost in his clientele, allowing Jimmy to rent his own office space and hire a full-time secretary, Francesca. In the midst of this career resurgence, Jimmy and Kim have concocted an elaborate plan to ruin Howard Hamlin's reputation, ensuring a swift end to the Sandpiper lawsuit, and therefore an immediate massive payout for Jimmy and Kim. While Kim insists this scheme was all about getting the money necessary to fund her benevolent, low-paying legal work, Jimmy begins to fear how much he may have corrupted his wife. First, Jimmy and Kim repeatedly plant evidence to make it appear that Howard was addicted to cocaine. Then they frame Howard to appear as if he was regularly and publicly soliciting prostitutes. Howard's lawyer friend and fellow lead on the Sandpiper case, Clifford Main, confronts him about the cocaine and prostitution, but Howard insists that Jimmy is framing him. Mike then pays Kim a visit to reveal that Lalo is still alive, and he has assigned his men to follow her in case Lalo tries to make contact. A shaken-up Kim is still resolved to move forward with the plan against Howard. When Cliff notices Kim's work ethic and commitment to defend those that can't afford proper legal counsel, he offers her a meeting with a foundation that financially supports lawyers with similar motivations. This was everything Kim ever wanted, and achieved by her own skill and dedication. But the meeting coincided with the final stage in her plot against Howard. Despite Jimmy's reservations, Kim can't help but to ditch the meeting to complete her plan. During a meeting with Howard, Cliff, and a mediator for Sandpiper named Casimiro, Howard makes a complete fool of himself. Jimmy and Kim had secretly drugged him, making him appear high and unhinged. Jimmy and Kim had also tricked Howard into believing that they had bribed Casimiro, prompting Howard to publicly accuse Casimiro of illegally accepting the bribe. Howard is left humiliated in front of his colleagues, and Cliff informs him that they would now be forced to immediately settle the Sandpiper case for much less than they had hoped. As Jimmy and Kim celebrate the successful completion of their plan, a distraught Howard arrives to confront them. Unfortunately, Howard is not the only visitor that would unexpectedly unexpectedly drop in on Jimmy and Kim. Lalo tricks Gus into thinking he was going to attack him that night, prompting Mike to redirect all of his men, including the ones watching Jimmy and Kim, to protect Gus. And so, Lalo enters Jimmy and Kim's apartment in the middle of Howard's confrontation. Despite Jimmy and Kim's pleas, Lalo shoots Howard in the head before telling the couple that they all needed to talk. Lalo orders Jimmy to drive to Gus's home and shoot him in the head, threatening to kill Kim if he doesn't. Jimmy is able to talk Lalo into sending Kim instead, in the hopes that Kim will run away to safety. But Kim plans on saving her husband and follows Lalo's directions to Gus's house in order to kill him. Mike intercepts Kim and, upon learning of Lalo's location, races with his men to Jimmy and Kim's apartment. When Gus learns that Lalo was talked into changing his plan, he deduces that this was all just a distraction. Gus is right, as Mike's team finds Jimmy alone and tied up in the apartment, with Lalo nowhere to be found. Instead, Lalo heads to the secret meth super lab to film evidence of its existence to use against Gus. Despite Mike's orders to stay put, Gus can't help but head to the super lab himself with his small remaining team of men. Lalo kills Gus's men and forces his rival to confess on camera to his many crimes against cartel leader Don Eladio. After making his confession, Gus enacts his own plan for revenge, using a gun he had previously hidden in the lab to finally kill Lalo once and for all. Mike stages Howard's death to look self-imposed following his drug addiction being publicly exposed. Howard and Lalo are then buried together underneath the meth super lab, which Gus then tells Mike to resume construction on. Following Howard's death, a guilt-ridden Kim quits her job as a lawyer and breaks up with Jimmy. They had gone too far. They had ruined the reputation of a good man, which accidentally led to his death, all because it was fun for them. As Kim tells Jimmy, "I love you, but so what?" That love wasn't worth the damage it caused. With Kim out of his life, several years pass and Jimmy fully transforms into Saul Goodman as a coping mechanism, wearing gaudy suits, sleeping with prostitutes, and working with known criminals. After signing divorce papers and giving her portion of the Sandpiper settlement to Saul, Kim runs into a young criminal named Jesse Pinkman outside Saul's office. Jesse asks if Saul was a good lawyer, as he was in need of one. Kim tells Jesse he was when I knew him, and so Saul Goodman is set on his course of becoming the criminal lawyer for Albuquerque's future drug kingpin, Walter White. Season 1 of Breaking Bad introduces high school chemistry teacher Walter White. While celebrating his 50th birthday, Walt reflects on all of the ways his life has gone wrong and he has failed to reach his fullest potential. He feels like he gets no respect from his pregnant wife Skyler, teenage son Walt Jr., his chemistry students, or even his boss at a car wash that serves as the demoralizing second job he needs to pay his bills. And when Walt is diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, he realizes the sad legacy he will leave behind. Walt then learns from his pompous brother-in-law, DEA agent Hank Schrader, of the large amounts of money that can be made from selling drugs. While on a ride-along with Hank, the DEA bust a meth lab and arrest the cook Emilio, but Walt witnesses a second culprit escape. Walt recognizes the man as Jesse Pinkman, a troublemaking and drug-addicted but ultimately well-meaning former student. Walt tracks down Jesse and proposes a partnership where Walt will use his knowledge of chemistry to make the most pure crystal meth on the market, while Jesse will use his drug-dealing connections to sell the superior product. While making meth in an RV out in the desert, Jesse brings in his contact Crazy 8 to distribute Walt's product. Unfortunately, Crazy 8 brings along his cousin Emilio, who recognizes Walt from the DEA raid and assumes the drug deal is actually a setup. As Crazy 8 and Emilio attempt to kill Walt and Jesse, Walt uses his chemistry skills to create a poisonous gas. Emilio is killed by the gas, but Crazy 8 survives. As Jesse reluctantly follows Walt's instructions to dissolve Emilio's body in hydrofluoric acid, Walt tasks himself with finishing off Crazy 8. Walt finds the task of committing murder to be impossible for him until Crazy 8 attacks him and Walt is forced to kill him. As Walt spends more time with Jesse and their meth business, Skyler begins to grow suspicious. suspicious. To explain his behavior to his family, Walt finally reveals his cancer diagnosis and begins chemotherapy. Unaware of her husband's burgeoning drug dealing career and worried of the financial ramifications of his chemo treatments, Skyler reaches out to Walt's former colleague Elliot Schwartz. Walt and Elliot had formed a company together out of college known as Gray Matter, but Walt left the company and sold his stake for a mere $5,000 after breaking up with his lab assistant fiancée Gretchen. Elliot and Gretchen then got married, and Gray Matter went on to thrive in Walt's absence, using his original research to gain a valuation worth billions of dollars. Despite Elliot and Gretchen's offer to pay for Walt's chemo treatments, Walt refuses the financial help due to his own pride and ego. And so Walt tasks Jesse with finding a bigger distributor for their meth so they can bring in more money fast. Jesse then sets up a partnership with local drug lord Tuco Salamanca. While meeting with Tuco, Walt creates the persona of Heisenberg, a mysterious, cool, imposing threat. Everything Walt wishes the world saw him as. Heisenberg impresses Tuco by fearlessly standing up to him, and the drug lord agrees to pay $70,000 a week for meth. Needing to cook more than ever before, Walt and Jesse are forced to steal barrels of a compound called methamphetamine in order to keep up with Tuco's demands. This new process of cooking gives Walt's meth a blue coloring, which soon becomes infamously dubbed Blue Sky by its users. Meanwhile, while looking into the disappearance of Emilio and Crazy 8, Hank and the DEA uncover the rise in popularity of the mysterious Heisenberg's Blue Sky meth. Hank realizes its quality is so superior to all others that Heisenberg could become the new kingpin of meth in all of Albuquerque, New Mexico. In Season 2 of Breaking Bad, Tuco Salamanca proves himself to be a violent and erratic business partner, even beating his own Lieutenant Nodos to death. After assigning his other Lieutenant Gonzo to dispose of Nodos's body, Gonzo's arm is crushed in an accident and he bleeds to death. As Hank, his partner Steve Gomez, and the rest of the DEA discover the bodies, they begin an elaborate manhunt for Tuco. Knowing his days in America are numbered, Tuco kidnaps Walt and Jesse and takes them to a hideout with his mute and paralyzed uncle, Hector Salamanca. Tuco awaits for his cousins to arrive and transport them all to Mexico, where Walt and Jesse will be forced to produce their Blue Sky meth non-stop. Skyler begins to fear the worst during Walt's disappearance and asks for Hank's help in finding him. Hank learns of Walt's involvement with Jesse, but is under the impression that Jesse is simply Walt's weed dealer. At the hideout, Jesse attacks Tuco and he and Walt attempt to flee, right as Hank arrives, having tracked Jesse's car. As Walt and Jesse escape undetected, Hank gets into a shootout with Tuco, which ends with the drug lord's death. Walt fakes falling into a medical fugue state with no memory of his past several days as a cover story for his worried family. Meanwhile, Jesse's car being at Tuco's hideout puts him in the crosshairs of the DEA, which prompts his parents to kick him out of his home, which has their name on the lease. Jesse then moves into a new apartment and falls in love with his neighbor, the building's property manager, Jane Margolis. With Tuco no longer their distributor, Walt and Jesse are forced to sell their meth themselves. Jesse employs his friends Skinny Pete, Badger, and Combo to act as their dealers. When Skinny Pete is robbed by a customer, Walt coldly insists on asserting their power and pressures Jesse into taking violent action against the thief. Jesse discovers that the thieves are a married couple of drug addicts who neglect their young son. As Jesse tends to the child, the wife murders her husband, leaving Jesse distraught and turning harder into drugs for comfort. As Jesse isolates himself in a depressive state, Walt uses the rumor of Jesse murdering the husband Spooge to strike fear in both their customers and rivals and expand their operation. When Badger is caught by the police selling meth, the DEA hopes they can get him to flip and deliver to them the infamous Heisenberg. To get Badger out of police custody and save himself from arrest, Walt hires the shady criminal lawyer Saul Goodman. After successfully clearing Badger and Walt from the DEA's suspicions, Saul becomes Walt's full-time legal counsel and teaches him how to launder his drug money to make it appear legitimate to the government. Meanwhile, still unaware of Walt's burgeoning drug empire, the pregnant Skyler returns to work in order to help support her family. At work, Skyler grows close to her boss, the recently divorced Ted Beneke. When Skyler discovers that Ted is committing major tax fraud with his company, Skyler agrees to help keep his secret. When Walt discovers that his cancer is in remission, he ends his partnership with Jesse and returns to his normal life. But the power he felt as Heisenberg has gone to Walt's head, causing him to act out in bursts of pettiness and aggression. And when copycats tried to encroach on Heisenberg's territory in his absence, Walt's ego drives him to resume his partnership with Jesse and continue the expansion of their drug empire. Elsewhere, Hank gets a promotion at work but begins to suffer from crippling panic attacks. His wife Marie, meanwhile, develops an obsession with shoplifting, despite being financially secure, which causes a strain on her relationship with her sister Skyler. When Combo is killed by a rival dealer, Skinny Pete becomes too scared to deal and quits. And with Badger still under the watch of the DEA, Walt and Jesse are left with no way to sell their meth. Jesse becomes distraught by Combo's death and falls heavier into his meth addiction, while the recovering addict Jane introduces him to heroin. When Walt goes to Saul for help in finding a new distribution partner, the lawyer connects Walt with Gus Fring, the quietly powerful and unassuming owner of a chain of chicken restaurants known as Los Pollos Hermanos, who also just happens to be one of the most powerful and dangerous kingpins in the area. Gus is initially reluctant in working with Walt as he sees Jesse's spiraling drug addiction as a serious liability. To secure his deal with Gus, Walt is forced to miss the birth of his daughter Holly to deliver his first shipment of meth. Instead, Ted accompanies Skyler to the hospital and offers his support. At first, Walt refuses to give Jesse his share of their earnings from their new partnership with Gus, fearing that Jesse would simply use it to fund his and Jane's drug habit. At a bar, Walt has a chance meeting with Jane's father, Donald, who laments about Jane's struggles. Inspired to reconcile with Jesse and help him get truly clean, Walt returns to Jesse's apartment, but finds him and Jane unconscious from a drug binge. As Walt tries to wake Jesse, he inadvertently knocks the sleeping Jane onto her back and she begins to choke on her own vomit. Walt chooses not to help and instead watches as Jane dies. When Jesse wakes the next day and finds Jane dead, he blames himself and falls into his deepest depression yet. Walt chooses to keep his involvement in Jane's death a secret, allowing Jesse to carry his guilt, and then checks his drug-making partner into rehab. Meanwhile, Saul Goodman tasks the professional criminal cleaner Mike Ehrmantraut to clean up the drugs and any evidence tying anyone to Jane's death. As Walt checks himself in for an extended stay in the hospital to fully remove the cancer from his lungs, Skyler uncovers evidence of a long history of lies by her husband. As Walt offers to explain the full truth to Skyler, she can't bear to hear it and instead leaves him. As the season comes to a close, devastated by his daughter's death, Donald becomes distracted at his job as an air traffic controller, inadvertently causing two planes to crash into each other, leading to the deaths of many innocent people, a tragedy that tracks all the way back to Walter White. In season 3 of Breaking Bad, Walt reveals to Skyler that he has secretly been cooking meth and is in fact the infamous Heisenberg. Skyler is shocked and disgusted by this revelation, but promises not to reveal this secret to the authorities, in exchange for Walt signing divorce documents and giving her full custody of their children. When Walt refuses to leave his family, Skyler decides to sleep with Ted and throw her affair in Walt's face. Realizing his drug making has cost him his family, Walt decides to back out of his deal with Gus. Meanwhile, Jesse leaves rehab, clean and sober, but still grieving the death of Jane. He then tasks Saul Goodman to help him buy back his home from his parents. With Walt no longer willing to cook meth with him, Jesse uses all that Walt has taught him to create his own batch of blue sky. Gus agrees to buy Jesse's meth, secretly knowing that Walt's ego will bring him back into the business. Gus then gives Walt a tour of a meticulously crafted underground meth lab for Walt to cook his blue sky product in peace, and makes a final push for Walt to resume their partnership to provide for his family. Walt Walt finally relents, giving Skyler what she wants by moving out of their family home and signing the divorce documents, and agrees to work with Gus Fring in a deal worth millions of dollars. Walt then cuts Jesse out of the deal and ends their partnership for going behind his back and using the Blue Sky formula without his permission. While working for Gus, Walt is given a new assistant, Gail Bedecker, who is a professional chemist that instantly bonds with Walt over their shared love of science. Meanwhile, the furious Jesse continues making his own knockoff Blue Sky and teams back up with Skinny Pete and Badger to sell it on the streets. Tuco Salamanca's cousins Lionel and Marco then arrive from Mexico, searching for the infamous Heisenberg to enact their revenge. Gus tasks his professional fixer Mike Ehrmantraut to watch over Walt and his family, then diverts the Salamanca cousins' attention to Tuco's real killer, DEA agent Hank Schrader. Meanwhile, Hank continues his investigation into Heisenberg and discovers evidence connecting Jesse Pinkman to the RV meth lab. As Walt tries to destroy the RV at a junkyard, Jesse arrives, inadvertently leading Hank right to them. Walt and Jesse hide out in the RV, and Walt has Saul's secretary fake a phone call from the hospital to Hank, informing him that Marie had been in a terrible car accident. Hank races to the hospital, allowing Walt and Jesse to destroy the RV and escape without being detected. When Hank realizes he'd been tricked, he blames Jesse and loses control, violently attacking the drug dealer in his home. In order to prevent the petty Jesse from pressing charges on Hank and ruining his career, Walt convinces Gus to fire Gail and bring in Jesse as his meth cooking partner once again. Hank is suspended from the DEA and forced to temporarily turn over his gun and badge, but is then attacked by the Salamanca cousins. Hank manages to incapacitate Lionel by ramming him with his car, but is gunned down by Marco. As Marco attempts to finish Hank off, the DEA agent manages to use Lionel's gun to kill Marco. Both Hank and Lionel are hospitalized in critical condition, and to hide his involvement in turning the cousins onto Hank, Gus has Mike kill Lionel. When a high-ranking member of the Mexican cartel, Juan Bolsa, calls Gus to demand answers, Gus rats out Juan Bolsa to the Mexican federales, who gun down the cartel leader. The attack on an American DEA agent causes the Mexican government to crack down on drug shipments across the border, leaving Gus to take full control of the drug trade in the area for himself. Following the shootout, Hank is bedridden and told by doctors he may never walk again. As Hank and Marie are left with massive medical debt, Skyler lies about Walt being a compulsive gambler who has accrued millions of dollars playing blackjack, and offers to pay for Hank's medical bills. Skyler then calls off her divorce from Walt to ensure better legal protections for herself, and then helps Walt buy the car wash he previously worked at in order to launder money faster. As Walt and Jesse continue their partnership with Gus, they begin producing a surplus of Blue Sky, which Jesse begins stealing to sell with Badger and Skinny Pete on the side. While selling Blue Sky to members at a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, Jesse meets and falls in love with the single mother Andrea, who is raising a young son, Brock. Jesse also learns that Andrea's kid brother Tomas had fallen into a life of crime and drugs, and that he was in fact Combo's killer. When Jesse confronts the gang of kids, he realizes that they are also selling Blue Sky, and therefore must be in Gus's employ. Jesse brings this revelation to Walt, who is dismayed about Gus's dealers hiring kids to sell drugs, but ultimately pleads with Jesse to stand down. Jesse is undeterred and attempts to attack the dealers with a poison called ricin. Jesse is stopped by Mike and one of Gus's enforcers, Victor, and brought to a meeting with Gus and Walt. Gus demands that Jesse stand down and vows to force his dealers to no longer employ children. Jesse agrees to stand down, and Mike warns Walt that Jesse's behavior is a liability to Gus's entire operation. Jesse then learns that because the dealers had no more use for their kid employees, they murdered Tomas. Devastated by this act, Jesse relapses into his old meth addiction and prepares to kill the dealers himself. As a shootout is about to erupt, Walt arrives, killing the dealers and warning Jesse to run. Walt pleads for Gus to allow Jesse to live, which Gus agrees to, though he reinstates Gail as Walt's partner once again, now under the close watch of Victor. Walt realizes that if Gail learns to perfectly recreate the Blue Sky formula, Gus will have no more use for Walt or Jesse. And so Walt devises a plan with Jesse to find and kill Gale, making Walt and Jesse indispensable to Gus. Unfortunately, before Walt can kill Gale, he is captured by Mike and Victor. As Walt pleads for his life, he agrees to turn over Jesse. Mike allows Walt to call Jesse to lure him into a trap, but Walt instead warns Jesse that he needs to kill Gale now. And so, as the season comes to a close, Jesse arrives at Gale's apartment and reluctantly shoots him dead. In Season 4 of Breaking Bad, Victor races to Gale's apartment and forces Jesse back to the meth lab, where he and Walt beg Gus to spare their lives. In response, Gus murders Victor in front of them, sending a message that they both need to be on their best behavior moving forward. Instead of being scared into backing down, Walt buys a gun and plans to use it on Gus, fearing it is only a matter of time before Gus kills him. Mike informs Walt that he is aware of his assassination plot, and then reveals that he will never meet with Gus face to face ever again. Meanwhile, following the murder of Gale, Jesse has fallen back into drugs and depression. Fearing his behavior will be a liability to their operation, Gus and Mike orchestrate a robbery to embolden Jesse and make him feel like a hero. Mike feigns impression in Jesse's skills and asks him to serve as his official backup on supply drops, continuing to make Jesse feel special and give him a purpose. As Jesse's new responsibilities pull him away from his work in the lab, Walt realizes that Gus is trying to drive a wedge between the partners. In response, Walt pressures Jesse to use his new position to kill Gus with ricin, which he hides in a cigarette. After learning of Gale's death, Skyler becomes concerned for the safety of Walt and their family. The increasingly prideful Walt insists that he can't be killed due to his importance, and that he is the real danger. Feeling more self-righteous and powerful, Walt splurges on an expensive new car for Walt Jr. Realizing this purchase would draw attention toward their drug money, Skyler allows herself to look like a villain in her son's eyes by forcing Walt to return the car. But Walt isn't the only man in Skyler's life that is being irresponsible with money, as Ted Benecke's tax fraud is finally discovered by the IRS, and Skyler is implicated in the cover-up. Ted is allowed to avoid prison time if he pays off his debts, and so Skyler gives him all of Walt's hidden money, totaling over $600,000. Instead of paying off his debts, Ted decides to buy himself lavish gifts, forcing Skyler to go to Saul Goodman for help. Saul sends his accomplices Huel and Kuby to scare Ted into paying the IRS. But when Ted runs away from the men, he trips and breaks his neck, leaving him permanently paralyzed. As Hank struggles to regain the ability to walk, he falls into a deep depression and begins emotionally shunning his wife Marie. Marie returns to her kleptomania, while Hank becomes obsessed with collecting minerals. In an attempt to pull Hank out of his depression, his police detective friend gives him the lab notes of Gale Boetticher to investigate, discovered in the chemist's apartment after his murder. Hank begins to believe that Gale may have been Heisenberg, but the prideful Walt insists that the lab notes imply Gale was copying someone else's work. This act of ego inspires Hank to continue his investigation, and he discovers a connection between Gale and Los Pollos Hermanos. Emboldened by his renewed desire to catch Heisenberg, Hank begins making progress in his rehabilitation. Hank discovers that Gus's fingerprints were found in Gale's apartment, and also begins investigating the mysterious German parent company of Los Pollos Hermanos, known as Magical Electromotive. Ultimately, the resourceful Gus is able to clear his name with the DEA, but Hank remains suspicious and refuses to back down. Meanwhile, Gus's drug shipments begin being attacked by the Mexican cartel. With the cartel continuing to elevate their hostility toward Gus, he relents in sharing their territory, and promises to send Jesse to Mexico to teach them how to cook blue sky. When Jesse goes to Walt for help, Walt instead admonishes Jesse for failing to kill Gus, leading to the two getting into a brutal fight that severely fractures their relationship. Gus has been planning his takedown of the Mexican cartel for decades, as its leader, Don Eladio, had tasked Hector Salamanca to murder Gus's lover and original meth cooking partner Max, and forced Gus into joining them. Now, Gus vows to take down the cartel and make everyone, including the mute wheelchair-bound Hector Salamanca, pay for their past sins. When Gus and Mike take Jesse to Mexico to teach the cartel how to cook blue sky, Gus poisons Don Eladio and all all of his top lieutenants, effectively wiping out the entire cartel. When they are attacked by Joaquin Salamanca, Hector's final remaining family, Jesse kills him to save the injured Gus and Mike. Gus takes Jesse to a nursing home to visit Hector Salamanca and gloat that the last of his family is dead. And Gus then honors Jesse's loyalty by naming him as the new head meth cook over Walt. Gus then has Walt kidnapped and taken to the middle of the desert, where Gus fires him and warns that Hank will be killed due to his investigation, and if Walt tries to interfere, Gus will kill his entire family. Walt disobeys Gus's orders and warns the DEA that Hank's life is in danger, then turns to Saul Goodman for help in making his family disappear to live a secret life away from the threat of Gus. When Walt goes to find the $500,000 he needs to pay Saul for the disappearing services, he realizes that Skyler had used the money to pay Ted, and now all of their lives are in grave danger. When Brock, the son of Jesse's girlfriend Andrea, becomes severely ill and hospitalized, Jesse realizes that his ricin-filled cigarette is missing. Walt insists that Gus must have poisoned Brock to frame Walt, driving a further wedge between the former partners. Remembering that Gus had allowed Tomas's death, Jesse believes Walt's claims and teams up with his former partner to kill Gus once and for all. Jesse relays to Walt the only location where Gus lets his guard down, the retirement home of Hector Salamanca. Walt makes a deal with Hector to enact his revenge against Gus, and when Gus goes to visit his old rival, Hector uses the bell on his wheelchair to detonate a bomb which kills them both. With Gus dead, Walt and Jesse continue to tie up their loose ends, burning down the meth lab to prevent the suspicious Hank from discovering it. Jesse then learns that Brock had actually gotten sick from ingesting a poisonous flower known as Lily of the Valley, meaning that Gus had not in fact been the culprit. And as the season comes to a close, it's revealed that Walt had in fact stolen the ricin cigarette and poisoned Brock with Lily of the Valley to manipulate Jesse into aligning with him to kill Gus. In Season 5 of Breaking Bad, Saul Goodman is furious with Walt for killing Gus and attempts to break off their business partnership for good. But the increasingly sinister and prideful Walt demands that Saul continues working for him. Saul insists that with Gus gone, Walt can safely retire from cooking meth, but with Skyler using his money to pay for Hank's medical bills and Ted's taxes, he has no money left to retire with. Meanwhile, Mike is also furious over Gus's death, but also warns Walt and Jesse that the DEA are now seriously looking into Gus's operation, which could lead to all of their arrests. With Gus's laptop confiscated in the police station, Walt and Jesse concoct a plan to use an electromagnet to destroy the laptop from outside. Walt then proposes that Mike join himself and Jesse in a new meth operation, but Mike refuses, viewing Walt as too volatile. When the DEA freezes all of Gus's assets, including the $2 million that Mike had stashed away for his granddaughter Kaylee, Mike reluctantly relents and joins Walt's new operation, even blackmailing the shady Madrigal Corporation's executive Lydia Rodarte-Quayle to supply methamphetamine to Walt, just as she had previously done for Gus. And in need of a new location to do their blue sky cooking, Walt, Jesse, and Mike's new business uses the cover of Vominos Pest Control to secretly cook meth in their unsuspecting customers' homes. Meanwhile, Skyler is terrified of the man her husband has become and begins suffering from severe panic attacks. This leads to a brutal confrontation where Skyler admits that she wishes Walt's cancer would come back and kill him. She then has Walt Jr. and Holly stay with Hank and Marie under the guise of marital troubles due to her affair with Ted to keep them away from the dangerous Walt. Elsewhere, Hank gets a promotion in the DEA for his investigation into Gus Fring. While continuing his investigation into the connection between Gus and the mysterious magical electromotive, Hank and the DEA begin planting trackers on Lydia's methylamine shipments, prompting Walt's crew to find another source for the valuable blue sky ingredient. Lydia points Walt toward a train carrying massive quantities of methylamine, and so Walt, Jesse, and Mike stage a train heist alongside criminal Vominos Pest control employee Todd Alquist. The crew successfully pull off the heist, but as they celebrate, they notice they have been seen by a young boy, who Todd then callously kills with no remorse. Jesse is distraught over Todd's actions, but Walt is shockingly unbothered. This prompts Jesse to finally end his partnership with Walt, while Mike quits to avoid further suspicion during the DEA's investigation. Mike and Jesse want to sell the methamphetamine to a rival meth dealer, Declan, which would net them all $5 million each. But Walt refuses and hides the methamphetamine for himself. Walt instead makes a deal with Declan to be his new distributor in exchange for buying out Mike and Jesse's positions in the company. Mike flees to avoid the investigating Hank and the DEA, but Walt refuses to allow Jesse to leave, holding on to his share of the money in the hopes of forcing him into continuing their partnership. Valuing his morals over the money, Jesse ends his partnership with Walt and allows him to keep his share. In turn, Walt is forced to use Todd as his new meth lab assistant. As Mike attempts to flee town, he is forced to trust Walt to deliver to him his go bag with all of his getaway essentials. Before handing over the bag, Walt demands that Mike relay to him the names of all of Gus's incarcerated employees that Mike has been paying off to ensure their silence during DEA interrogations. Mike refuses to betray his former colleagues and admonishes Walt for allowing his ego to ruin everything. In a fit of petty rage, Walt shoots Mike, and Mike stoically tells off Walt a final time before dying in peace. Walt then makes a deal with Lydia, who agrees to help him distribute his meth and expand his empire overseas, while also delivering to him the name of Gus's former henchman that Mike had been paying off. Todd introduces Walt to his uncle Jack, a gangster from the Aryan Brotherhood, who Walt pays to have his men viciously kill all of the imprisoned henchmen to ensure their silence. With his empire finally on stable footing, Walt spends the next several months amassing massive amounts of money. Walt begins to contemplate if he finally has enough and attempts to reconcile with Jesse by gifting him the money he was rightfully owed, and promising Skyler he is finally ready to quit, leading to them reconciling and bringing Walt Jr. and Holly back home. But this final step toward a happy ending is completely upended when Hank discovers a book dedicated to Walt by none other than Gail Bedecker. And so finally, Hank realizes that his unassuming brother-in-law is in fact the infamous Heisenberg. When Walt realizes that Hank has uncovered his secret identity and is building a case against him, Walt menacingly threatens his brother-in-law. Upon learning of the truth, Marie is devastated that her sister Skyler has been complicit in Walt's crimes. To get Hank to back off and not take his suspicions to the DEA, Walt blackmails him with a faked confession, claiming that Hank was actually the mastermind behind Heisenberg, who forced Walt into cooking meth. And as evidence of Hank's involvement, Walt points out that his drug money was used to pay for Hank's medical bills. Amidst this turmoil, Walt discovers that his cancer has returned, but chooses to keep it a secret from his family. Meanwhile, Declan has been left in charge of both cooking and distributing Blue Sky in Walt's absence. When his quality falls below Lydia's standards, she has Uncle Jack's crew kill Declan so that Todd can take over as the new Blue Sky cook. Fearing Hank's investigation, Walt encourages Jesse to use Saul's contacts to disappear and start a new life elsewhere, with a new name and a clean slate. As Jesse prepares to follow through with this plan, he finally pieces together that Walt had in fact poisoned Brock to manipulate him into turning on Gus. Jesse vows revenge on Walt, leading to both Saul and Skyler suggesting that Walt kill his former partner, but Walt refuses. In turn, Jesse agrees to work with Hank and his partner Steve Gomez to gather the evidence needed to prove Walt is Heisenberg and lock him up for the rest of his life. Jesse devises a plan to trick Walt into believing that Jesse has found his hidden stash of money and threatens to burn it all. As Walt races to the spot he buried his money in the desert, he angrily rants about all of the crimes he has committed to leave a fortune for his family after he is gone. Walt also finally relents and hires Jack and his gang to kill Jesse once and for all. But when Walt arrives in the desert, he realizes the ruse, as Jesse, Hank, and Gomez arrive, revealing that they've recorded discredit his confession and arrest him. Walt accepts defeat and calls Jack to stand down before being loaded into the back of Gomez's car. As Hank calls Marie to celebrate his victory, Jack and his gang arrive, ignoring Walt's orders to stand down. Despite Walt's pleas, Jack and his men murder Hank and Gomez and then steal most of Walt's money. Defeated, the spiteful Walt insists that Jack and his gang carry out their hit on Jesse, but Todd suggests they instead kidnap Jesse and force him to cook meth for them. Walt accepts this arrangement, but not before heartlessly revealing to Jesse that he had allowed Jane to die. To ensure Jesse's cooperation, Todd murders Andrea, and Jack threatens to murder Brock. Walt then returns to his home, where he frantically tries to convince his family to pack their things and join him to start a new life elsewhere. Skyler realizes that Walt's actions have gotten Hank killed and threatens Walt to leave at knife point. As Walt attacks Skyler, Walt Jr. intervenes, attacking his own father and calling the police. Realizing he has lost his family, Walt makes a phone call, knowing the police would be recording it, and claims that Skyler was unaware of his drug empire in order to protect her from any criminal charges. Walt then meets with Saul's contact Ed Galbraith, who helps him disappear and gain a new identity, living in seclusion in New Hampshire. After months of living alone and forced to confront his sins, Walt prepares to turn himself over to the authorities. But first, he calls his son to inform him that he'd be sending the remainder of his money. Walt Jr. says that he has changed his name to Flynn and that he wishes his father would die. Before Walt can turn himself over to the authorities, he sees a television interview with Elliot and Gretchen Schwartz, where they attempt to distance the Gray Matter Company from the criminal Walter White. His ego sparked once again, Walt abandons his surrender and returns to Albuquerque to end things on his own terms. Walt threatens Elliot and Gretchen to set up a trust in Flynn's name and ensure that he receives the remainder of Walt's fortune. Walt then visits Lydia and finally uses the ricin from Jesse's cigarette, poisoning her and ensuring her imminent death. Next, Walt visits Skyler for a final time, admitting that despite his claims for becoming Heisenberg to provide for his family, it was actually to satisfy his own pride. Walt then says a final goodbye to his family and heads to Jack's compound for a final confrontation. As Jack, Todd, and their gang of Aryan Brotherhood members surround Walt and bring out the broken Jesse, Walt tackles his old partner to the ground and activates a machine gun that kills all of Jack's men. Amidst the chaos, Jesse kills Todd, while Walt shoots Jack dead. Walt was injured in the gunfire and asks Jesse to finish him off, but Jesse refuses. Instead, the two former partners bid each other a reluctant farewell. As Jesse flees, Walt succumbs to his injuries, accepting his imminent death and finally content with all that he has accomplished. In the film El Camino, Jesse seeks out the help of his old friends Badger and Skinny Pete to help him escape Albuquerque and avoid the pursuing police. Jesse breaks into Todd's apartment, searching for money he would need to pay Ed Galbraith to help him secure a new identity. While there, Jesse is confronted by a pair of thugs, Neil and Casey, who agree to split Todd's money with him. As the group part ways, Jesse recognizes Neil to be the welder who built the rig Todd used to keep him imprisoned and cooking meth. When Jesse reaches Ed, he discovers that he does not have enough money to pay for the disappearing services, and so Jesse seeks out Neil and Casey, demanding the money he needs. Instead, Neil challenges Jesse to a duel, which Jesse happily agrees to, gunning down both men and stealing their money. Jesse pays Ed for his services and is taken to Alaska to start a new life, having previously heard stories about it from Mike. Jesse gives Ed a letter to give to Brock, then departs to start his new life, optimistic for the first time in years. In season 6 of Better Call Saul, following the events of Breaking Bad, the DEA begins looking into Saul Goodman for his involvement with Walter White. Jimmy hires Ed Galbraith to help make him disappear, giving him a new life as the manager of a Cinnabon in Omaha named Gene Takovic. Gene reflects on his glory days while living a secluded life without many connections, fearful that his past will come back to haunt him. His worst fears are realized when a taxi taxi driver named Jeff recognizes him as Saul Goodman. Gene considers once again having Ed disappear him, but instead resolves to handle the situation himself. He helps Jeff and his friend Buddy pull off a heist at the local shopping mall. Following the successful heist, Gene threatens to rat on Jeff and Buddy if they ever reveal his true identity. It's now been 6 years since he last saw Kim, and Gene gives her a call in the hopes of reconnecting. Kim has moved to Florida to live a boring but decent life, far removed from all of the drama. When Kim shows no interest in speaking with her ex-husband and tells him to turn himself over to the authorities, Gene loses it and slips right back into his conman ways. Kim, meanwhile, follows her own advice. She returns to Albuquerque and confesses the extent of her crimes to the judge, then does the same to Howard's widow. Although her conscience is now clean, it was unlikely Kim would face any jail time, as there is no physical evidence and the only living witness is her criminal ex-husband. Having cleared her conscience, Kim begins volunteering at a free law clinic, bringing her back to her dream of helping those who needed her most. Meanwhile, Gene teams back up with Jeff and Buddy to pull off more cons, stealing the identities of wealthy businessmen around Omaha. But Gene pushes things too far and Jeff winds up arrested. Jeff's kind-hearted and trusting mother Marion begins to realize that her son was involved with a dangerous man and discovers that the so-called Gene Takovic is actually Saul Goodman and reports him to the police. Saul Goodman is arrested and faces life in prison for his crimes in association with Walter White. While in custody, Saul manages to give an impassioned albeit false speech to Marie Schrader, detailing his innocence in Walter's crimes, even claiming himself to be a victim. This greatly offends Marie, whose husband Hank was one of the many actual victims. Despite seeing through his act, the prosecution fears that Saul will be able to con a jury and agreed to reduce his sentence to a mere 7 years. Saul feels smug and victorious until he discovers that Kim had confessed her involvement in Howard's death to not only the authorities but also Howard's widow, leaving her open to a civil suit that would permanently ruin her life. As Saul arrives in court to accept his sentence, he instead fully confesses to all of his crimes as Kim watches from the corner. He owns up to the full extent of his involvement in Walter White's crimes and takes full responsibility for Howard's death, absolving Kim of any wrongdoing. Saul even confesses to his spiteful schemes against his brother, which eventually led to Chuck's death. As Saul reclaims his name as Jimmy McGill, he is sentenced to life in prison. The other inmates recognize him as Saul Goodman and pay their respects to the infamous criminal lawyer. As the series comes to a close, Kim visits Jimmy in prison and the two share one final cigarette together.